what made the decision for you to preach from the chapter as a whole? And why is that final verse where Paul says, and we know that, all these truths about Christ, why was that so important in preaching on Paul's discussion about Christian freedom?
I dealt with the whole chapter because Paul deals with the glorious new life that we have in Christ and four freedoms that we have in this new life. Freedom from condemnation, obligation, frustration, and then no separation from the love of God in Christ. And the fact that we can live according to the Spirit and not the flesh or the world's standards. So that allows us to live a full life of joy and peace. But we have to know this freedom, not just intellectually, but experientially. And that's why it was so important for me to talk about, and we know that. Not just as a matter of, I heard this with this wonderful sermon, or I read this passage, it gripped me. But not only must we believe it, we must grasp it ourselves and then live it out practically every day. And it's and we know that.
Yeah, the way you said it is the way you said it in the sermon. And that's just kind of like connecting the dots for me again. It's like, oh, yes, that's what you mean when you say no. Can you just give us a little bit more of what you wanted people to take away that day when they heard you in that chapel?
I wanted the listeners to hear, as they struggle with the realities of life, all the things that keep us from living faithfully, living the new life that we have in Christ, that in Christ, positionally, we are justified. We've already been made righteous. God predestined us. He chose us. He called us to him. And one day we will be all that Christ is. But practically, we've got some things that have to be worked out. And that's what living the faithful life is all about. It's a process, day by day, making the right choices. I know that it takes discipline, it takes desire, and it takes devotion, single-minded fidelity to a certain course of life. It's hard work. And I also talk about the fact that we don't have to be frustrated over the things that are happening in the world and things happening in our lives, the things that happen to us. I say in the sermon that frustration is a choice. I can choose to live by faith, or I can choose to live by fear.
Frustration could be a choice. You specifically listed examples that were more sort of everyday challenges that people face, such as losing a job. There's a lot of unrest these days in regards to displacement of people globally, climate change. I mean, I can go on and on. Black Lives Matter is still an ongoing movement today in regards to racial justice issues in America, especially. And more recently, Stop Asian hate movements that have also arisen as well against anti-Asian violence. Do you have anything to say for listeners who are frustrated and feeling just like they can't move on, perhaps, or don't know what to do in terms of their faith in response to such, oppression and challenges?
Frustration is a lived reality. This became real to me over the last year in a profound way. One day I was sitting here in my home listening to the news, and I was reflecting on the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd at that point. I was so frustrated and so hurt, so sad, so overwhelmed that I cried out, God, they're going to kill all of us. I cried out in pain, and I realized that this was nothing new, that this frustration had been a low-level boiling inside of me. It was kicked up again when, as a resident of Atlanta, a gunman went into 3 spas, killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, women like myself.
Right.
That's when I determined that it wasn't just a lived reality, but it's holy. Because I needed to discover what the frustration was teaching me and what God would have me to do. I entered Duke Divinity School in the fall of 1976.
Wow.
I believe that year, Miriam, that racism would be eliminated. How wrong I was.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're still dealing with the reality of racism, but I'm still fighting it. And I cannot give up. And perhaps it is that holy frustration that keeps me fighting, that won't let me give up. And so Paul is wrestling with that in this text because he talks about the frustrations, the struggles that we go through, but they're not worth comparing to the glory that shall be revealed. And God is working in all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, even the pain and the frustration. We must remember that and not think, we're denying our reality. No, I'm very much aware of our reality.
Right, right.
If I were not, then I would not work to change it.
Seems to me, interpreting the suffering that you are going through in your sermon with this quote, and it's really beautiful. So I'll just read it here. When you love God and trust God, then you know that nothing can happen in your life that God does not permit and God does not intend to use for your benefit and for God's glory. Those who face the most challenges in life are the ones that have the most hope and, can be really encouraged by this quote when they're going through these challenges. But I think it also holds a danger in that they might think that God holds a hand in all things and we can explain all suffering away with God's providence. So how do you balance this tension in your preaching?
I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that God knows all things. I believe that nothing is impossible to God and that God knows what is going to happen. I also believe that God can stop bad things from happening to us, but I know that there are times when God does not. And that's a hard place. That was a hard thing for me to learn. There was a young woman in my church who had cancer. And the last time I saw her before she died, she had lost all of her hair. Beautiful young woman, had lost all of her hair. She was too weak to lift her head off of the pillow. She looked at me and said, "Pastor, I just want to see what God's going to do with me now." That's the eulogy I preached. I just want to see what God's going to do with me now.
There's a sort of wonderment in that statement too that I find so beautiful.
Isn't it?
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure, it's gorgeous. When she said it, I said, I knew immediately that she wasn't going to make it. I knew that she was giving me her eulogy.
Right, right.
She gave it to me.
Wow. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this sermon was just sort of seeing you go into the pulpit and really live into it. I know one of the first comments you made was, I don't need a stool because I'm much taller than Will Willimon, who usually preaches here on Sunday. And I really just love that. And of course, it took some laughter from the audience, but then it also just sort of placed you into the pulpit very naturally. And in the sermon as well, I think you used a lot of language and examples that everyone could have related to, which is very inclusive as well. And I'm wondering what that experience was like in that space where, not very many, the far majority of people have been white men.
Yeah,
Like,
that's right.
how are you able to bring your whole person into that?
When I went into the pulpit that day, it was a dream come true. First of all, because it was the Duke Chapel. Then it was because the Duke Chapel is where Dr. Will Willimon preached. And I had then and still do great love and adoration and admiration for Dr. Willimon. And so Dr. Willimon is very free, and I knew I could be too.
Yes.
And so I just went into that pulpit being myself and allowed myself to be the tall, beautiful,
Yes.
African-American woman that I am, because they needed to see that in the pulpit. And people had been so warm and welcoming that I knew that I was quite at home being there. I know what it's like as an African-American woman not to be included. When I came to Duke Divinity School, the guy said that God didn't call women. And so I heard that every day. Now, they didn't treat me that way, but they talked that way. And so I said, I will never leave others out. I will be very intentional about including all people. And so I do that naturally. I want to make sure that my illustrations speak to every person in the room that I'm able to speak to. Again, that is why Romans 8 is so important to me. And preaching the fact that we have been set free in Christ, free to live life according to our purpose, free to live life in service to others, and free to live life in such a way that we are pleasing to God and a blessing to everyone we come in contact with.